So, the West collectively ignores Russia's nuclear threats. The ruble falls off a cliff. Russia may have had its highest casualty count in one day. The situation in Georgia is deteriorating, and there is a seriously big offensive ongoing. Oh, and all of this is happening in the shadow of a new administration. Yep, today should be a fun one. At a time when Americans were distracted first by pardoning turkeys, perhaps as practice for later pardons, and then outright eating other turkeys, the Kremlin had a very eventful week, almost none of it being good news to Russian ears. And the timing of it could not be worse for those in Moscow. You see, the incoming Trump administration is in the process of deciding how to handle its foreign policy. The default expectations are that Trump will just want to end things in Ukraine, without too much concern about where to draw the new lines on maps. But the more vulnerable that Russia appears, the more compelling it will be for Trump to attempt to achieve a signature foreign policy accomplishment. So, today, we will look at the 5 big pieces of news for Russia, in order of just how bad they were for the Kremlin. Starting with, well, the lack of news about Russia's nuclear threats. After that, the high casualty figures coming in. Then the cratering economic situation in Russia, before heading over to Georgia, and finally wrapping up with the astonishing offensive in Syria. But we begin with the collective non-response to Russia's nuclear threats. Let's get through this one quickly, because we have already discussed how this got started with the United States clearing the way for ATACMS strikes inside of Russia. Well, Russia responded by striking Ukraine with a missile that tops out at Mach 10, followed by this televised speech from inside the Kremlin, where Putin essentially warned the West that continued long-range artillery attacks would be fruitless and only result in Russia striking back with its new unstoppable missile. Be careful, you could mount a nuclear weapon on it. And the West? Their leaders collectively shrugged. Ukraine seems to be attacking with ATACMS as if nothing had happened. Ostensibly emergency talks, yes, but no substantive changes to the policy. For its part, surely Russia would have wished for a different outcome, but it is not like the missile strike gave relevant new information to the West. This type of response was baked into the Biden administration's decision to grant Ukraine that opportunity. No surprises here means that it was a continuation of a bad outcome for Russia, and thus ranks as the least important point from last week. But hey, at least it made a whole lot of headlines. Actually, most of these stories reached massive audiences, going from 134 outlets to a near-universal 503 sources. Moreover, they tended to reach all segments of the media landscape, though the ground offensive in Syria tilted a little more toward the left. Even then, the right was more likely to emphasize the extremist ideology of the rebels currently taking territory. Only the story of Ukrainian claims about Russian casualties flew under the radar. How do I know all of this? Well, it is thanks to our returning and continuing sponsor, Ground News. You'll remember Ground News as the ultimate news aggregator, collecting articles from outlets around the world into a single feed. Never has it been easier to compare the headlining practices of news outlets. And for a limited time, my viewers get 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, exclusively through my link, ground.news/linesonmaps. So head over to that link or scan the QR code to better inform yourself and support this channel. Moving on from the non-news to actual news, we turn to Russia's high casualty figures. This report comes from the Ukrainian military, claiming that on November 28th, Russia suffered 2,030 casualties, the highest daily total in the war so far. Now, as a starting point, take that with a grain of salt, because the source has an inherent incentive to over-report true numbers. As such, I would put less faith in the 2030 number, and more that Russian casualties are generally high right now. Such a belief is consistent with high equipment losses, which are independently tracked and visually verified. The reason that this is low on the scale of bad news for Russia is that it is also consistent with Russian expectations coming into the month. Again, news is only news when something unexpected happens. Here, though, Russia has stepped on the accelerator in anticipation of Trump entering office and pursuing an end of the war. In fact, it is something that we discussed right after Election Day. And while I am sure that Russia will not be pleased to see such headlines, Moscow is gaining something in return: reasonably sized chunks of Ukraine. Excluding the initial phase of the war, November once again set a new high in terms of Russian territorial gains, at more than 700 square kilometers. The vast majority of the changes occurred in Donetsk, specifically with Russia pulling a wide section of the front closer to the general direction of Pokrovsk. The second piece of bad news came with a bit more surprise: a sudden decline in the ruble's value. As of Thursday, November 21st, 100 rubles could still buy $1. But on Wednesday, November 27th, they could only manage 90 cents. The upshot for Russia is that 100 rubles rebounded to 94 cents by Monday, December 2nd. And by the 5th, they got back to $1. However, it was only a year ago that you could exchange them for $1.10. The reason that this does not qualify as the worst news for Russia is that the trajectory of the decline was already expected. The Russian economy is weak in its non-military sectors. That is what happens when the government controls the printing machines and has a seemingly insatiable appetite for materiel. In turn, that is cut into the productive manufacturing sector, and less stuff means higher prices for what remains. It does not help that wages are up due to the Ministry of Defense contracts offering large sums of money, and the traditional labor market having to raise wages to keep pace. All of that has resulted in more money chasing fewer products. As a consequence, the Russian central bank has raised interest rates to 21% in October, and is projected to keep going with the increases. To make matters worse, rates overall have been high by Russian standards for the last year, which is also starting to cut into new investments. Now, what caused the specific plunge over the prior week is not as obvious. The best guess, and where the Russian central bank places the blame, is on a fresh round of sanctions against Gazprom Bank. It was the last major institution untouched by the sanctions regime, a concession to make life easier on the Eastern European countries still importing from parent company Gazprom. But the US Treasury finally decided to shut down that opening. That would not quite explain why the ruble went back up afterward, but regardless, the falling value of the ruble more generally will cause significant problems for the Kremlin's war effort. But notably, it is not about to bring the residents of Moscow out to the streets to protest. On the macroeconomic growth side of things, this is a disaster for Russia. Normally, the silver lining of a currency collapse is that it makes your export industry more competitive. After all, workers in the country do not directly notice the currency's lost value, and importers are happy to get a good deal by exchanging their currency for products denominated in the weaker currency. However, this all falls apart when sanctions prevent exporters in the weak country from sending their goods abroad. Instead, the Kremlin will now pay a higher implicit cost to make those purchases abroad, things like Iranian drones or payments to North Korean soldiers. The instability of the ruble more generally will force Russia's finance minister to dip into the Kremlin's foreign reserves, as the exporters might not be inclined to accept Russian currency. In terms of domestic instability, though, a falling ruble will not cause much of a concern for the average Russian. They live their daily lives thinking of things in terms of rubles, not how many dollars that they can exchange their rubles for. Now, indirectly, inflation is a problem for average Alexanders. However, remember that they are all receiving pay raises right now, which is the main driver of that inflation. So they actually come out of this with a net positive. Rather, if a tumbling ruble will cause Putin to think twice about regime security, the threat will come at the elite level, the people who have rubles they might want to spend abroad, but now are looking at substantially reduced purchasing power. They are already feeling constrained because of the war more generally, so just add that to the list of grievances against Putin. Where things begin to get spicy is with the growing protests in Georgia. Though it seems so long ago now, this is basically the aftermath of the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia, in which Russia tried to disrupt Georgia's membership pathway to NATO by intervening in Tbilisi's conflicts with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That was successful, and the two regions have been under Russia's umbrella since then. To grossly simplify the last 16 years, domestic politics within Georgia has been a debate between one group that wants closer relations to Russia and another that wants to push toward Europe. The former group benefits from the threat of further interventions from Moscow if the pro-Europe crowd pushes too hard. Well, there was an election on October 26th that Georgia Dream, the pro-Russia party, won. Except protests erupted 2 days later, when demonstrators alleged that the results were fraudulent. November 28th saw a spike in the protests, when Georgia Dream announced that it would punt negotiations to enter the European Union until 2028. And if you are thinking to yourself, a pro-Russia party announcing a delay in EU integration, which causes protests to erupt, doesn't that sound familiar? Well, yes. Yes, it does. That is how the 2014 Ukraine protests started, which are the prologue to the current war. The broader strategic context here is that part of what deters protests, and also protests erupting into outright revolution, is the threat of Russian intervention. Well, Russia is otherwise occupied right now, to say the least. And we already saw the consequences of this last year, when Azerbaijan made its move in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, Russia was supposed to be providing a peacekeeping force there, but Azerbaijan correctly wagered that Putin was not about to pull troops from Ukraine to handle the matter, thereby allowing Azerbaijan nearly free reign in the region. And all of that was before Russia had to call in North Korean troops to shore up the lines in Kursk. But it was still not the worst news that Russia received, because there is a big difference between protests on the streets and actual lost ground. And that takes us to the final piece of bad news for Russia, the ongoing offensive in Syria. Now, this time, if you were thinking to yourself, wait, the Syrian civil war is still ongoing? Well, surprise, because it is escalating. Actually, the long duration is not surprising. Most interstate wars end within 2 years. The invasion of Ukraine is remarkable in that regard, especially because a much larger share of conflicts never even reach the threshold of destruction to receive the war moniker. In contrast, it is not uncommon for civil wars to extend past a decade, and with Syria, we are at 13 years at this point. Why is there such a stark difference between interstate and civil wars? Well, it is not for a lack of international effort. But the full answer is complicated and would warrant its own video. Suffice it to say that it is hard for rebel groups to maintain their military strength post-settlement. In turn, they worry that the government will exploit any deal made, and so they simply continue to fight instead. Where settlements do occur, they tend to require third parties to enforce the terms. And again, to simplify a very complicated situation, that is more or less what was going on here, with Russia playing the role of an enforcer of a somewhat followed ceasefire dating back to 2020. In particular, Russia's role was to protect the Assad regime from rebel incursions. That was an expensive undertaking for Russia, but the Kremlin had good motivation. To ensure some stability around the Tartus naval installation, Russia's only port on the Mediterranean Sea. Hold that thought for a moment. And also like Georgia, part of the calculation here appears to be the rebels betting that Russia will be in no position to enforce the ceasefire, so long as the war in Ukraine continues. Combine that with Israel's evisceration of Hezbollah, and you are looking at a golden opportunity to make an advance. And goodness, did they advance. This is what the situation looked like on November 28th. Apologies for the ridiculousness, but sadly the days of two-sided wars are long since past us. The area between these flags is what the Assad government controls. The segment down here is a buffer area around a US base, which is not relevant for our discussion today. Then there is a front against Kurdish forces, and within that, the Kurds have a line with the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. But that one is not important for right now either. Further west, there is another segment of the Syrian National Army, plus the Syrian Salvation Government. And it is this last one that actually matters. So, to stay focused, let's get rid of everyone else. Just as Americans were sitting down with extended family to enjoy some turkey, the animal, not the country, HTS, the military arm of the Syrian Salvation Government, attacked Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. But they did not stop there. 1 week later, this is what the situation looked like. I tried doing a very rough estimate, and I have HTS adding about 16,000 square kilometers of land in a week. A lot of it is desert, yes, but that is still a ton of territory. To put that in context, remember that Russia only gained about 700 square kilometers in November. Now, there is a difference between advancing that much territory and holding that much territory. Whether the Syrian government will find a way to push back remains to be seen. Same goes for whether Russia will find a few spare forces to assist in that effort. But the concern for Moscow is what happens if the rebel groups keep pushing south. Remember Russia's Tartus naval facility? The one that looked like this? Well, it is right here, which means that rebel troops only need to push to here to cut off its land resupply. Note that Russia also has an airbase in the region, but you really do not want to be flying things in if you can avoid it. Moreover, the war in Ukraine makes life further complicated for Russia here. Under the terms of the Montreux Convention, Turkey, back to the state, not the bird, is preventing any warships from going through the Bosporus Strait. Consequently, Russia's nearest naval resupply must come all the way from the Baltic Sea. And this ranks as the worst news for Russia, as the sheer scale of the problem is enormous. However, as a closing thought, the timing of all of these problems makes them so much worse. If this had all happened in December 2023, it would have been bad, but not awful. You see, the political situation in the United States was static at the time. In contrast, December 2024 is anything but static. Biden is waving goodbye to his term in office, and is no longer concerned about optics. Meantime, Trump will soon enter the White House, and he needs to finalize his foreign policy. Remember, this is a man who has crafted a reputation for being able to manufacture a good deal from nothing. For years, he has focused on Europe shouldering more of the West's security burdens, which would allow the United States to save a bit of money. Had Russia projected a sense of strength going into January, there would have been little reason for Trump to deviate from that path. But Trump is also a fan of splashy signature achievements. Remember how he proposed buying Greenland? Well, Google apparently does. It was the first autofill for me. As a comparison, Reagan will remain in the historical narrative as the president who forced the Soviet Union into submission. If Russia is showing signs of weakness, then Trump will be tempted to do something similar. And that is why the timing of this is so poor for the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the timing has never been better to buy one of my books about the war. They are excellent stocking stuffers. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.